So before we get our hands dirty with MobX, let's just take a look at a few of the MobX concepts we need to know to help us move forward. And we'll start off with why MobX. There's a few choices with state management when it comes to applications in React, because React doesn't really come with a centralized state management solution such as Redux or MobX, which is what we're going to be using. Then you've got choices. And why MobX? Well, there's a few reasons that I selected MobX for this particular course, and one of the main reasons was the fact it's written in TypeScript, and it makes it very easy to integrate into an application that's written with TypeScript. And there's a few other reasons as well, and it's pure simplicity of working with it. If I just take a couple of quotes that I've stolen from their documentation about what people are saying about MobX, and one of the quotes there is, working with MobX is basically a continuous loop of me going, this is way too simple, it definitely won't work, only to be proven wrong. And another quote is, I have built big apps with MobX already, and comparing to the one before that, which was using Redux, it's simpler to read and much easier to reason about. And the key theme of there is really simplicity. MobX is incredibly easy to work with. And let's take a look at its core functions, the things that we're interested in. MobX uses observables. And observables are great. They're like the next stage that promises will eventually become in JavaScript. Things will start to use observables rather than promises. And observables are concerned with the state of something over time, whereas a promise is really just a one-time thing. You ask for this thing, it promises it's going to give you it, and then it gives you it. And that's your interaction with a promise finished. But observables are something that you can observe, and as their state changes over time, then you can react to that state change. And they're pretty good. We also have the concept of actions, and actions change the states of observables. And we'll be taking a look at these in more detail. Also, we have the nature of computed properties. If we already have some state inside an observable, and we want to derive from new state from what we already have, then we can use computed properties. And again, computed properties are something that we can observe, and when their state changes, we can react accordingly. Talking of reactions, we also have such a thing as reactions in MobX. And any of our observable states, we can react to it changing in some way and use a side effect which will do something in our application. And there's also something called auto-run, which is very similar to reactions, but the difference between a reaction and an auto-run is that an auto-run will always run even when the store is initialized before the observable you're reacting to has actually changed, whereas a reaction will wait until the observable has changed from its initial state, and then you'll react to that change. So let's just run through the different functions in a bit more detail before we start getting our hands dirty. And first of all, we'll take a look at the MobX observable. Now, there's a few things going on in this particular slide. And first of all, MobX uses classes to store the state. We don't use a simple function when we're using MobX. We create classes for each store we want to create, and we can have multiple stores. And inside this class, we have two observable properties, a first name and a last name, and inside the constructor of the class we use the makeObservable function, and we use the list keyword to say that we want to do something with properties inside this class, and in this case we're just using a MobX observable to make these properties observables. So now they would be observable states. The other thing that's going on in here is we're using the React create context method to pass in a new instance of the store that we're going to create. Now we'll talk a little bit more about context or React context very shortly, but this is a basic MobX store. So if we want to change the observable state inside this store, we could use a MobX action. And inside here we have an action called setFirstName, and this is going to update the observable of the first name equal to whatever the name is passed into this function. And then we use, inside the constructor, we set the function, setFirstName, as a type of action. And we use actions to update observable states, and then anything that's observing the observables will be notified of that change. We also have MobX computed properties. And in this case, a computed property marks a getter. In this case, we're using a getter to get the full name. And then we can derive the full name from the state that we already have. In this case, the first name plus the last name. And we would mark this full name property as a computed property inside our constructor where we're using the make observable. Now we don't have to use make observable either, because MobX can infer what's going on inside the class by using the make auto observable function. And then we just pass this into the parameters of the make auto observable, and then MobX is going to infer that the first name last name properties should be observables. It's going to infer that the get full name, because it's got a getter, is going to be a computed property, and it's going to infer that the set first name is an action because it's a function inside our class. Now notice that we also use arrow functions inside here, and the reason being is that arrow functions automatically bind to a class in JavaScript. Normal functions do not, and you need to take an extra action on a function, or you need to do something extra with a function, a normal function, in order to bind it to a class. We'll take a look at examples of that as well. Another thing that we can use inside MobX is a reaction, and we can react to observable state changing automatically inside our classes. And in this example, we have a reaction. Now, a reaction takes two parameters. It takes a function or an expression to identify what state we want to observe, and then we can do something with the state that's changing, in this case just logging out to the console every time the first name is updated. So we'll be using these in our application as well because they're incredibly useful and they allow us to do something when our observable state changes inside our classes. Now I'll just mention React context as well, because what we've currently been doing is we've been passing down properties to components via components. And if we look at this structure, then if we wanted to get something from our top component, let's say that's the app.tsx, down into our child component, let's say that's our activity list items, then we need to pass down the properties or the state via component to component to component. And that's causing quite a lot of extra code inside our application at the moment, because some of these components are passing down states that they do not care about and do not need themselves, but we need to get those properties to a child of a child of a child. And that's the only way we really have at the moment. But when we introduce React context, what we're going to be able to do is each individual component is going to be able to access the MobX store directly, and we're not going to need any middlemen to pass down props to. We're simply going to have a component that's going to be able to access the store directly and get whatever properties or actions or computed properties it needs to render the view of what we see in our user interface. Now, when we use React context, then we've got a hook available that we can make use of, and in our MobX classes, we create the context, and then to consume the context, we can use the use context method that we see here. And then we've got access to any of the properties, actions, computed properties inside the store. Now, we'll do it slightly differently. We'll create our own hook to help us with this. And we'll also have multiple stores inside our React context. But this is just an example of using, creating context and consuming it in a React component. What we're also going to be using, because we want our components to have the power to observe observables inside our MobX stores, and to help us with that, we're going to be using something called MobX React Lite. Now we have one use for this particular library. We're going to be using the observer from MobX React Lite, and the observer is a higher order function. Now a higher order function takes as a parameter a function, and what it returns is a new function that in this case has extra powers. It has the power to observe observables from the MobX store. Now we're going to be implementing all of this in this section, so don't worry if this was brief and not 100% clear, because using MobX is so nice and straightforward to use. It will become very clear, hopefully by the end of this section. So what we'll do next is get our hands dirty and start implementing MobX in our application.